According to Roman tradition, the new republican system was created in 509 BC when the last king was expelled and denied entry to the city. Looking back, later Romans treated this as a revolutionary turning point. But in constitutional terms, the change seems surprisingly limited. The basic royal power known as imperium, the authority to command armies and exercise power over life and death, was not abolished. Instead, it was divided between two annually elected magistrates, the consuls, who may originally have been called praetors. These men were chosen by the centuriate assembly, the body supposedly organized by Servius Tullius, and they inherited many of the king's military and civic functions. Later on, in the 5th and early 4th centuries BC, this supreme role was sometimes shared among several officials known as military tribunes. Like the earlier kings and the city guardian before them, they had the right to summon the Senate. From a later Roman perspective, most of the civic and religious structures were thought to continue almost unchanged. The key assemblies, especially the centuriate assembly and the tribal assembly, were both attributed to the regal period, with only their form and use developing over time. These bodies seem to have taken over from the older curiate assembly, which tradition associated with Romulus. Major priestly colleges, such as the pontiffs, augurs, the Vestal Virgins, and the board responsible for sacred texts, were all said to have existed already under the kings, and to have carried on into the Republic without interruption. Only one new religious office, the King of Sacred Rites, who performed certain rituals on behalf of the vanished monarchy, was explicitly linked to the beginning of the Republic, and even that timetable is debated. The Senate, too, is presented as a continuing council of leading men. Some ancient writers suggest its membership changed frequently, following the fortunes of leading families year by year, while others imply a more stable body. What is clearer is that the Senate's composition and power were reshaped later by reform laws in the 4th century BC, when tribunes of the plebs pushed through important changes. Taken together, this picture suggests striking continuity rather than a clean break. The main political spaces and buildings of the city remained in use. The Senate House, the Forum where assemblies met, the Great Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline, and key temples such as those of Castor and Saturn. Even the circus, where public games and triumphal processions took place, seems to link the worlds of king and republic. The archaeology does not always line up neatly with the constitutional story, since many political gatherings happened in open spaces without fixed structures, and magistrates often used temples rather than purpose-built offices. Even so, the physical fabric of the city gives little sign of an institutional revolution in 509 BC. This makes sense when we remember that our written accounts of these events were composed centuries later and were shaped by patriotic storytelling. Yet it is still notable how rarely the founders of the Republic are credited with inventing new institutions. Under the early Republic, the main magistracies came to be monopolized by men from a recognized hereditary elite, the patricians. These belonged to certain powerful lineages, or gentes, and enjoyed privileges that seemed to have roots in the monarchy. Ancient writers claimed that Romulus had created an initial senate of 100 men, whose descendants formed this privileged class. In their telling, these men were distinguished by birth, virtue, wealth, and the fact that they already had children, while the rest of the population, poorer, less prominent, without such pedigrees, became the plebeians. The name patrician was linked to the word for fathers and evoked the authority of elder statesmen. status was passed down within families, which helps explain why later aristocrats invested so much effort in tracing long, unbroken family trees back to legendary figures. Earlier modern scholars tried to explain the patrician-plebeian divide as the result of some ancient racial conquest, imagining one people subduing another. But the ancient evidence does not support this, and those theories owe more to modern racial thinking than to anything genuinely Roman. A more convincing view sees the patriciate as the product of a long process stretching from the later Bronze Age into the 5th century BC, during which leading families gradually built up political, religious, and economic power, and then presented that dominance as ancient and natural archaeology across central Italy shows how this kind of aristocracy took shape. From the late Bronze Age onwards, graves begin to stand out for their richness. In the Orientalizing period, roughly from the early 7th to the 6th century BC, elite burials become increasingly lavish, filled with imported goods, jewelry, chariots, weapons, and symbols of authority such as thrones and scepters. These tombs do not celebrate individual men alone. Women and children also appear buried with signs of high rank, suggesting whole households claimed special status. Over time, multi-chambered tombs protected by large mounds emphasize continuity across generations and project the idea of an enduring noble line grand residences, like the palatial complexes found at sites in Etruria, reinforced the same message in life as the tombs did in death. All of this fits well with the later image of Roman patrician families who believed they had an ancestral right to rule, and who used myths of deep antiquity to justify their privileges. Modern historians disagree about just how far these aristocratic groups controlled the early Roman state. One line of thought emphasizes the dominance of great clans, suggesting that institutions and offices largely served their private interests, and that rural districts were effectively ruled as family domains. The fact that some country tribes appear to bear the names of leading gentes, such as the Claudii or Fabii, may point to this kind of territorial control. In this view, the early republic looks almost like a system run by a network of dynasties, using the machinery of the state to maintain their wealth and authority. Other scholars argue that the power of these families must be understood alongside, and not in place of, the growth of state institutions. The clans themselves, on this reading, were shaped and strengthened by the development of the city and its political structures, rather than standing outside and above them from the beginning. Comparative work on other ancient societies shows that aristocratic claims of timeless authority usually conceal a history of contest, negotiation, and change. In Rome, as in many pre-modern states, elites may have been powerful, but they still needed the cooperation of the wider population to fight in armies, pay dues, and support collective decisions. The remarkable expansion of Rome in the centuries after the monarchy suggests that, even in its earliest republic, the city was more than just a playground for a handful of families. It was already a functioning state whose institutions and people, though unequal, worked together enough to sustain long-term growth. Modern historians disagree on the exact number of patrician families in early Rome, and no consensus list has emerged. Dionysius of Halicarnassus claimed that fewer than 50 remained by the late Republic, reflecting the high mortality and political instability that often brought patrician lines to an end. Originally, though, the patrician class was likely much larger, possibly numbering around 130 families. Over time, new groups were added. For instance, Tarquinius Priscus is said to have expanded the Senate by introducing minor clans. though these included both patrician and plebeian families. After the fall of the monarchy, a further group called the conscripti were enrolled, leading to the traditional Senate address of fathers and conscripted. One late example of addition to the patriciate is the arrival of the Claudii, whose leader Attus Clausus migrated to Rome with his followers in the early 5th century BCE. Patrician power relied on multiple privileges. One was their auctoritas patrum, the authority to ratify decisions passed by popular assemblies, whether elections or laws. Although this power was later limited by reforms such as the Lex Publilia and Lex Mania, which required this approval to come before votes rather than afterwards, the patricians retained other advantages. They claimed exclusive rights to hold the interregnum, a period in which they supervised the transfer of power, and they monopolized most major priesthoods. Control over religious practices strengthened their political influence, especially through the concept of holding the auspices, or consulting divine will. This exclusive claim often sparked conflict, as in 445 BCE, when plebeians challenged their exclusion from the consulship, provoking patrician arguments that only their class could properly interpret the god's signs. Despite the eventual broadening of political and religious roles, in early Rome, these religious offices were tightly linked to patrician identity and prestige. The fact that many of these priesthoods, especially the Flaminas and Rex Sacrorum, carried deeply archaic traditions suggests religious authority was central to patrician power even during the monarchy, when kingship gave way to a dual consulship and annual elections. This division of power opened the political stage to non-patricians, but religious control remained largely intact, bolstering patrician dominance. The early republic was marked by growing tension between patricians and plebeians, often referred to as the struggle of the orders. This conflict stemmed from both social and economic grievances. Rome's military setbacks in the early 5th century, along with population pressures and massive debts, worsened conditions for ordinary citizens. Plebeians suffered from poverty and lacked land, and increasing numbers fell into debt bondage. While some plebeian leaders may have been newcomers to Rome, others were farmers or property holders whose status and contributions to the army did not shield them from exploitation. The idea that patricians were ancient natives while plebeians were outsiders is a myth. Both orders go back to the same early traditions. The collapse of the monarchy also empowered the masses, as the final kings are portrayed as having courted popular support. With the Republic's introduction of elected magistrates, even within assemblies weighted toward wealth, non-elite voices gained a symbolic platform. Connections with Greek cities in southern Italy and Sicily, where democratic movements were spreading, also influenced Roman political awareness. Meanwhile, the rise of heavily armed infantry, self-equipped citizen soldiers, meant that ordinary farmers wielded new military and political leverage. Patrician supremacy appears to have peaked in the later 5th century BCE. Records known as the Fasti Consulares show that about 1/5 of magistrates in the early 5th century came from non-patrician families. This proportion sharply declined over the next decades, dropping to almost nothing. By the century's end, only 1% of magistrates came from outside the patrician class. This pattern, often called the closure of the patriciate, suggests a deliberate consolidation by the patrician elite. It also explains the rise of plebeian agitation, a coalition of wealthy non-patricians and oppressed poorer citizens who began organizing in the late 6th and early 5th centuries. The first formal act of plebeian resistance was the secession of 494 BCE. According to tradition, widespread debt and mistreatment at the hands of creditors sparked a mass withdrawal of plebeian soldiers and city dwellers. They marched to the Sacred Mount, just outside Rome, refusing to return until guarantees were made. After negotiations, a compromise was struck, and plebeians were granted the right to elect their own representatives, the tribunes of the plebs. A second secession followed in 450 BCE during the crisis surrounding the Decemvirate. This special council of 10 had been appointed to draft Rome's first written laws, but soon acted tyrannically when the decemvirs refused to step down and abused their power, including in the infamous case of Appius Claudius and the girl Virginia. The plebeians again withdrew, first to the Palatine Hill and then to the Sacred Mount. These secessions became defining events in the struggle for political equality and set powerful precedents for collective action among Rome's lower orders. The last and least clearly documented episode in this story is the third secession of the plebs, which took place in 287 BC. On this occasion, the plebeians withdrew to the Janiculum Hill and refused to return until they won a decisive concession. The outcome was fundamental. From that point on, decisions of the plebeian assembly would have the force of law for the entire Roman community, not just for the plebs. Our sources here are thin, partly because the detailed narrative of Livy for this period is lost. But what remains suggests that this final secession was treated as a serious military and political threat, carried out almost at the city's doorstep rather than in some distant camp. Ancient writers preserved several different traditions about the secessions. Most agreed that the first withdrawal of the plebs was to the Sacred Mount in the territory of Crustumerium, between the Anio and the Tiber. A less common version instead placed it on the Palatine Hill. The standard account then described two further secessions, one in 450 BC that moved from the Aventine to the Sacred Mount, and another in 287 BC that took place on the Janiculum. Other authors offered different numbers and sequences, and disagreed over details such as the exact year or the names and initial number of tribunes. Some of this confusion may be due to later distortions and the influence of experiences from the late Republic. For example, the withdrawal of Gaius Gracchus to the Aventine in 121 BC echoes the older stories and may have encouraged historians to see patterns. The famous fable of the limbs and the stomach, which Menenius Agrippa supposedly used to persuade the plebs to return during the first secession, was adapted from earlier Greek tales. The recurring appearance of the Claudi as villains and the Valeri as rescuers also suggests that later family historians reshaped the narrative in favor of their own ancestors. Even so, some core elements of these accounts fit very well with what we know of early Roman society. The central role of debt and economic hardship in provoking unrest is highly plausible. Equally convincing is the idea that the plebeians bound themselves together with a sacred oath, often called a lex sacrata. This was a type of solemn pledge common in central Italy, used to mark out a group dedicated to a god and to create strong bonds of loyalty. In this case, the plebs swore to protect their new tribunes and to treat anyone who violated their inviolability as accursed, with their property devoted to Ceres. The cult of Ceres had strong links with Campania and southern Italy, and a temple to Ceres, Liber and Libera, was dedicated on the Aventine soon after the first secession. The combination of these deities was Italian, but clearly influenced by Greek models like Demeter and Kore. and the temple became a center of plebeian religious and political life. The whole picture fits well with the early republic, not with later invention. Modern interpreters have debated how far we can trust the details and how we should understand the idea of secession itself. The third secession in 287 BC is generally accepted as historical, since it lay within living memory of the first Roman historians. The earlier secessions are more controversial, yet their very oddity argues in favor of a historical core. For more than 2 centuries, the plebs repeatedly withdrew from the city, not to start a civil war, but to exert pressure through organized absence. This pattern is unlike standard Greek stories of civic strife, and is difficult to explain as simple imitation. It suggests a distinctive Roman form of collective action in a world where people could move relatively easily from one community to another. Who exactly took part in these secessions is another major question. Some scholars have imagined the plebs as mostly artisans and traders, recent arrivals without patrons. Others have identified them with the poorest citizens, those below the property threshold for the army, which would explain why the elite were initially slow to respond. Yet all our ancient accounts stress that the withdrawals were led by armed citizens, that they were triggered by the burden of military service and debt, and that they took the form of a refusal to march against external enemies. It is more convincing to see the seceding plebs as a broad coalition that included many property-owning farmers serving as infantry, joined by poorer citizens and those already enslaved for debt. In this view, the secession was at once a military strike and a social revolt. The act of leaving the city also needs to be seen against the wider background of mobility in early Italy. People and groups often moved between communities, sometimes peacefully, sometimes as armed bands. To withdraw to a hill outside Rome, under arms and under oath, carried the implicit threat that the plebs might go further, found a new settlement, or ally with Rome's enemies. Some ancient passages make this idea explicit, describing fears that the plebs might defect to rival peoples, or suggesting speeches in which plebeian leaders toy with the idea of leaving Rome altogether and establishing a new community. Later episodes, such as rebellious garrisons trying to seize Capua, or groups like the Mamertines taking over Messana, show how easily mutiny could become colonization. Even if the seceding plebs never actually left Rome for good, the possibility gave their protest enormous weight. Out of this confrontation emerged a remarkably complex plebeian organization that almost resembled a state within a state. The plebs had their own assembly, the Concilium Plebis, which gradually took on formal powers. They elected their own magistrates, the tribunes and plebeian aediles, who were shielded by sacrosanctity and could veto the actions of consuls and senate. They had their own religious focus in the Aventine temple of Ceres, Liber, and Libra, which served as sanctuary, archive, and treasury. Over time, the decisions of their assembly came to bind all Roman citizens, and their tribunes became some of the most powerful figures in the Republic. Religious, political, and cultural influences, many coming from Greek cities in southern Italy, helped shape this movement, but it responded to specifically Roman tensions between wealth and poverty, power and exclusion. The secessions of the plebs were therefore not just dramatic episodes of protest, but turning points that reshaped the Roman state from within. The plebeian movement kept pushing for a fair share of political power and for relief from the hardships faced by poorer citizens. They did this through further secessions in 450 and 287 BC, and through constant political pressure inside the city, It was said to be the plebs who demanded that a special board of 10 men, the decemvirs, be created in 451 BC to draw up and publish a written code of laws. This board produced 10 laws and had them displayed on bronze tablets in the forum. The office was meant to last for only 1 year, but it was soon decided that the code needed additions, so a second board of decemvirs was elected. In their second year, things turned dark. The leading figure, Appius Claudius, was portrayed as turning into a tyrant. All other magistracies were suspended. There was no right of appeal against decemviral judgments, and the regime began to behave as if Rome were under one-man rule again. The board added only 2 further tables, one of which introduced a notorious rule forbidding marriage between patricians and plebeians. Together, the 12 tables of this code became a foundational text of Roman law. The decemviral regime itself was brought down in 450 BC, when the plebs once more abandoned the city in the Second Secession. This whole episode is one of the most complex and debated parts of early Roman history. The traditional story raises many questions. Although the struggle between patricians and plebeians is central to how the law code was later remembered, the surviving rules barely mention social conflict directly, apart from the ban on intermarriage. The idea that the plebs demanded the creation of the decemvirs, only for them to turn around and oppress their supporters, feels dramatic and ironic. The narrative is filled with vivid episodes that clearly grew in retelling, especially the story of Appius Claudius and the young woman Virginia. In this tale, Appius tried to have her declared a slave so he could possess her, and she was saved from that fate only when her father killed her himself. The story strongly echoes the fall of the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, and Greek tales about tyrants abusing women. There are also problems with the lists of the decemvirs given by later writers. The second board, which passed the discriminatory marriage law, is said to include a significant number of plebeians, which is hard to reconcile with the content of that measure. More broadly, the surviving rules of the 12 tables are not simply pro-plebeian. Many of them are strikingly harsh. Even so, there are good reasons to think that the core of the story is genuine. Fragments of the law code survive because later authors quoted them, and later Roman writers insist that generations of children memorized the entire text at school. The 12 tables seem to have drawn on older royal laws, on long-standing customs, and on the written codes already produced in other parts of the Mediterranean. Many communities in Greece and the Near East had set down law codes in the 7th and 6th centuries BC. These texts were designed less to shape political structures and more to calm internal tensions and reduce civil strife. That purpose fits well with what we can see in the 12 tables. There are some parallels with Near Eastern laws, but archaic Greek models were probably more important. Roman writers themselves insisted that Greek influence played a role. They spoke of commissioners being sent to study law in the Greek world and of a famous Greek exile who helped draft the code in Rome. The details of these legends cannot be taken literally, but the broader picture of strong Greek influence matches everything else we know about early Rome, which was deeply engaged with the Greeks. The surviving clauses of the 12 tables open an unusually clear window on the Rome of the mid-5th century BC. They show a layered and unequal society made up of several different groups: citizens with property, landless citizens, freed people, slaves, those bound by debt, and foreigners. Citizens were divided according to whether they owned land or not, which presupposes a working census long before the Middle Republic. The laws forbade illegal gatherings and punished betrayal of the community with death. Penalties in general were severe. Offenders could be hanged as an offering to Ceres, burned, cut up if they could not pay a debt, sold into slavery, or thrown from the Tarpeian rock above the Forum. Yet the code also contained some protections. It forbade the passing of special laws aimed at individuals and insisted that no one could be executed without a formal trial and condemnation. Conditions were particularly harsh for those at the bottom of the social scale. The rules on debt carefully defined the position of people bound over to their creditors. Debtors could be sold beyond the Tiber, which in practice meant being carried off into the territory of Veii, and fathers had the legal right to sell their children. Disputes over who was free and who was a slave were treated as normal. Injuries to slaves were punished less severely than those inflicted on free persons, though damage caused by slaves still had to be compensated by their owners. Other economic provisions show an economy centered on agriculture and land. Roads had to meet minimum standards. Fields and crops were to be protected from harmful rituals and incantations. The law code recognizes guarantors, sureties, formal debts, interest, and deposits, which hints at a more complex economic life than our later sources sometimes suggest. Foreigners could live in Rome, though they could not acquire ownership through long-term use. Fines were expressed in asses, blocks of bronze that served as a measure of value before regular coinage was introduced. Other sections of the code deal with the household, family, and wider social relations, and they reflect a strongly patriarchal outlook. Women were normally under guardianship, unless they belonged to a very special religious group, such as the Vestal Virgins' husbands, had formal power over their wives in traditional forms of marriage, though there were ways to avoid coming fully under a husband's control, and women were allowed to divorce and inherit property. If a person died without heirs, the estate went to the wider clan. The authority of the father over his children was extremely strong. He was permitted to kill a newborn who was severely disabled, and he could sell his sons into slavery. At the same time, the tables aimed to reinforce patronage ties. Freedmen were to remain attached to their former masters as clients, and patrons who mistreated their clients were cursed. In law, religion, and ritual also appear in the code. The laws mention the Vestals and Ceres, refer to sacred oaths, and regulate offerings left in sanctuaries. Harm done by magic was forbidden. One clause seems to concern the adjustment of the calendar. Another group of rules limited extravagance at funerals, cutting down on perfume, costly fabrics, gold, purple, and paid musicians. These measures show a concern with proper religious practice and with keeping elite display in check. The single most striking rule from the perspective of class conflict was the law banning marriage between patricians and plebeians. This makes clear that tension between the two orders was a real and pressing issue in the 5th century BC. We know that intermarriage had happened earlier, both in Rome and in neighboring cities, so the rule seems to be an attempt to harden social boundaries that had previously been more flexible. It may have been a reaction to the emergence of a self-conscious plebeian order and to the growing political strength of the plebs. The ban proved short-lived and was repealed only 5 years later by the Lex Canulea. But even in later centuries, anxieties about mixed marriages and status continued to surface in Roman stories and cult legends. According to the later tradition, the experiment of rule by the decemvirs ended with the second secession of the plebs. The immediate trigger was the killing of Virginia by her father to save her from Appius Claudius. The Roman armies, encamped outside the city, were stirred by this scandal and turned against the decemvirs. Soldiers abandoned their positions and marched first to the Palatine Hill, which was already an important center of plebeian life and politics. From there, they moved to the Sacred Mount outside the boundary of the city, the same place used in the First Secession, hoping to increase the pressure on the Senate by physically withdrawing from the civic community. The plebs agreed to return only when the decemvirs resigned. Appius Claudius was subsequently prosecuted and is said to have taken his own life. Power then passed to two consuls seen as sympathetic to plebeian interests, Valerius and Horatius, who introduced a set of laws in 449 BC. These measures restored the right of appeal, confirmed the powers and inviolability of the tribunes, and declared that resolutions passed by the plebeian assembly had legal force. Modern historians have been skeptical of some of these details, especially because similar laws on appeal and on plebeian resolutions appear again later in Roman history. This repetition has led some to argue that the early measures are inventions projected back from the 4th or 3rd century BC. However, many enactments affecting the plebs were passed between 449 and 287 BC, and it is quite possible that later reforms modified or revived older rules rather than creating them from scratch. What matters most is that this period saw a renewed compromise between the orders, in which the plebs secured lasting institutional tools, even if the exact wording and dating of individual laws remain uncertain. The rest of the 5th century BC was marked by ongoing social unrest and war on several fronts. The patricians continued to dominate the highest magistracies. In 445 BC, the Lex Canulea finally overturned the ban on intermarriage between patricians and plebeians. In the same year, its proposer also tried to open the consulship itself to plebeians. The Senate rejected this radical step and instead put forward a compromise. Rather than consuls, the people would sometimes elect several supreme magistrates called military tribunes, with consular power. Over time, their number rose from 3 to 4, and then to 6. In theory, this opened the way for plebeians to hold the top office, but in practice they were elected only very rarely in the 5th and early 4th centuries. BC, the system of military tribunes lasted until the consulship was restored and formally opened to plebeians by the Licinio-Sextian laws in 367 BC. The plebeian movement reached its greatest successes in the 4th century BC. Another turning point in the long conflict between orders came in 367 BC, once again triggered by a debt crisis and sharpened by the ambitions of plebeian leaders. According to the traditional account, the tribunes Licinius and Sextius were re-elected year after year from 377 BC and used their position to block the election of patrician magistrates between 375 and 370 BC, allowing consular tribunes to be chosen only from 370 to 367. Livy dresses this period in dramatic colors, even suggesting that Licinius's wife, offended by her sister's patrician marriage, pushed him on out of wounded pride. The sheer length of time in which normal magistracies were supposedly paralyzed also raises doubts. Modern scholars therefore question many details of the story, but they generally accept the main outcome. Around 368 BC, these tribunes are said to have succeeded in passing two measures: one law limiting the amount of land any individual could hold, and another restricting interest on loans. Later writers often assumed that the land law applied only to public land, because that is how Tiberius Gracchus framed his revival of it in the 2nd century BC, when he attacked holdings of more than 500 jugera of Ager Publicus. Yet the surviving wording does not actually restrict it to public land, and it probably covered all holdings. Such a sweeping limitation reveals how large elite estates had already become and how much anxiety they caused. It also shows that Rome was part of a wider wave of political change visible in contemporary Athens and the Greek cities of southern Italy, where ideas of more equal citizenship and equality before the law were gaining ground. In 367 BC, Licinius and Sextius are also credited with forcing through measures on the consulship and on religious offices. Livy reports that from then on, at least one of the 2 consuls should be a plebeian, and that plebeians were to be admitted to the priestly board, responsible for guarding and consulting important prophetic texts, which was expanded from 2 to 10 members. 5 of these posts went to patricians and 5 to plebeians. In return, the patricians were compensated with the creation of new annual magistracies reserved initially for themselves, namely the praetorship and 2 curule edileships, though the latter were soon opened to plebeians as well. In practice, this package of Licinio-Sextian measures did not immediately transform access to the consulship. The consular fasti show that between 355 and 343 BC, both consuls were still often patricians. A later measure, the Lex Genutia of 342 BC, returned to the same set of problems. Livy attributes to it a ban on charging interest on loans and a rule that both consuls could be plebeians. From that point onwards, one of the 2 consuls was indeed always a plebeian. But it was not until 172 BC that both consuls in a given year were plebeians. This pattern has led many modern scholars to suggest that Livy's presentation is slightly confused. The rules of 367 BC probably made plebeians eligible for the consulship, while a law in 342 BC may have insisted that at least 1 consul each year must be plebeian. Even if this reconstruction is more accurate, it still assumes that such laws were respected consistently, which may be optimistic. The struggle over offices was not only political, but also religious, because priesthoods were a central pillar of patrician dominance. The final stage in opening up this sphere came in 300 BC with the Lex Ogulnia, which increased the number of pontiffs and augurs and admitted plebeians into both colleges. From that point, plebeians could participate in all the major communal priesthoods, even though some of the most ancient individual roles, such as the high priests of certain gods, remained closed to them and reserved for patrician families. The last great constitutional milestone was reached in 287 BC, when the plebeians mounted a 3rd secession, this time to the Janiculum Hill. In response, a law associated with the dictator Hortensius granted full legal force to decisions passed by the plebeian assembly, making them binding on the entire Roman people rather than only on plebeians. An earlier attempt to achieve this in the mid-5th century had clearly failed in practice, and the fact that it had to be restated shows how fiercely the patricians resisted such changes. Taken together, these reforms produced a new ruling class made up of both patrician and plebeian families. This mixed nobility is visible in the consular lists, where plebeian names begin to appear with increasing frequency as rich plebeian houses won higher offices and entered the Senate. For poorer Romans, there was a price to pay. Once ambitious plebeian leaders had joined the governing elite, they were less inclined to act as champions of the very poor. Even so, the movement achieved real progress in easing exploitation. The formal abolition of nexum, the system under which citizens could be bound over to their creditors and effectively reduced to debt servitude, came in 326 BC. Although Livy's account of its repeal is heavily dramatized, the law itself is likely to be genuine and important. It implies that wealthy Romans now relied increasingly on slave labor, while also locking in the principle that free citizens should not fall back into a condition resembling slavery because of debt. From 334 BC onwards, the distribution of land seized in war, especially through the foundation of Latin colonies, also expanded dramatically. This policy reflected the same ideal that lay behind the old land laws: a community of citizen farmer soldiers with reasonably secure holdings, rather than a countryside dominated by huge estates and dispossessed laborers. Yet, as Appian's account of the opposition to Tiberius Gracchus in 133 BC makes clear, many members of the elite never embraced that ideal and continued to accumulate far more than the traditional limit of 500 jugera in public, let alone private land. At first glance, the secessions and prolonged social conflicts might suggest that a strong sense of shared civic identity barely existed in early Rome. If that was once the case, it must have been transformed by the gradual resolution of these disputes. One place where this shift can be seen is in the character of Rome's own historical memory, as preserved in later writers like Livy. The stories about the monarchy and earliest republic revolve around striking individuals. Kings and leaders such as Servius Tullius, Coriolanus, and Camillus. By the time Livy reaches the Middle Republic, his narrative looks different. The city and its institutions take center stage, and single heroic figures play a smaller role. This change in emphasis reflects several developments. The way Roman politics itself was structured to share power and limit domination by any one man, especially between the Gallic sack of Rome in 390 BC and the rise of generals like Scipio Africanus. The evolution of record-keeping, which came to focus more on magistracies, laws, and collective decisions, and more deeply, a redefinition of what it meant to be Roman. The settlements hammered out between patricians and plebeians helped to create a more coherent state, with institutions that could command the loyalty of a broad citizen body. Far from being a fragile or half-formed polity, the early republic emerges from this process as a remarkably resilient community, capable of absorbing internal conflict and using it to reshape and strengthen itself. Rome's international position between roughly 600 and 338 BC is crucial for understanding how the city grew, even though it was very different from what came afterward. During this early period, Rome was just beginning to act like an imperial power. By the late 6th century BC, it had built up dominance over other Latin cities, but its progress was interrupted by internal struggles and external challenges, despite having clear advantages like a larger population, fertile land, access to the Tiber River, and the resources shown by monumental buildings. Rome often failed to fully exploit its strengths. Internal conflicts, especially between patricians and plebeians, slowed its early momentum. Only when these social tensions eased did Rome begin to expand more efficiently and keep control of conquered territories. The political landscape of central Italy was unstable and complex, with shifting alliances and leagues that made long-term dominance difficult. Rome's rise depended on reorganizing these alliances in ways that served its interests. However, understanding this process is not easy, because most of our evidence comes from later Roman and Greek authors. Writers like Livy and Dionysius provide detailed accounts of Rome's early wars and treaties, but they wrote centuries after the events and often had patriotic or political motives. These sources tend to focus almost entirely on Rome's point of view, downplaying peaceful interactions and emphasizing military conflicts. Foreign peoples, such as the Etruscans, Samnites, and Gauls, appear mostly when they oppose Rome. Stories are often reshaped by oral traditions or family legends, which may exaggerate or distort Rome's achievements. Despite these issues, the broad outline of Rome's rise is consistent in most accounts. Setbacks in the 5th century are gradually replaced by more assertive policies in the 4th. Modern historians attempt to balance literary accounts with archaeological and epigraphic evidence, which can provide more neutral perspectives. It's also important to understand how earlier Greek writings influenced later narratives. Some of these Greek records captured contemporary observations, not just hindsight from the imperial age. Still, any reconstruction depends heavily on sources shaped by Roman ideas about destiny and power. In Etruria, neighboring cities played a significant part in Rome's early story. Literary sources often refer to a federation of 12 Etruscan cities, a structure mentioned by authors like Strabo. This idea may reflect some historical reality, possibly derived from Etruscan traditions. Strabo tells of a legendary founder who united 12 cities, only for the confederation to break apart later. However, the number 12 may have been symbolic, and ancient writers often disagreed on which cities were part of the League. Some later sources even mention 15 members. What is clear is that Rome was never included in this Etruscan union. Though influential, these neighboring cities would eventually give way to Rome's expanding power, setting the stage for the city's next era of growth. Ancient sources describe how Etruscan leaders gathered at a sacred site known as the Fanum Voltumnae, a major shrine dedicated to the god Voltumna. This site was located near Volsini, modern-day Orvieto, offering a central meeting point for the Etruscan cities. The League held an annual festival here, featuring religious ceremonies, games, and trade events that drew participants from across Etruria. Evidence suggests that this tradition continued well into the Roman era, even surviving through late antiquity, when Etruscan and Umbrian priests still organized rituals and celebrations. Recent excavations near Orvieto have revealed a large sanctuary complex, matching historical descriptions of the Fanum Voltumnae. Covering around 30 hectares, it includes monumental altars, ceremonial roads, temple foundations, and fragments of fine pottery from Greek and Etruscan sources. This impressive site supports the idea that the Etruscan League remained active for centuries, even after Roman conquest. However, the political strength of the League is debated. In one account, when Veii chose a king, the other Etruscan cities refused to support them, showing that the League did not always act in unity. Titles like Xilath Mekul Rasnal have sometimes been translated as referring to a magistrate ruling over all Etruscans, but it now seems likely they were local leaders rather than heads of a unified state. While there are references to combined Etruscan military efforts led by a single figure, these tend to come from myth or early history and don't reflect consistent political unity. Instead, the Etruscans seem to have functioned as a collection of independent city-states that came together only when needed. Shared religious rituals and occasional cooperation helped create a sense of cultural identity, but not a centralized nation. Some ancient sources claimed vast Etruscan power over all of Italy in earlier periods. While exaggerated, there is solid evidence that Etruscan influence spread beyond Tuscany into regions like Campania in the south and the Po Valley in the north. In Campania, cities such as Capua and Pompeii arose with strong Etruscan ties. Archaeological evidence shows Etruscan culture spread through funerary practices, architecture, and language. Capua, particularly, was a major Etruscan center, strategically located at a crossroads and boasting urban planning and monumental structures similar to Etruscan cities in the north. Later, these settlements fell to the Samnites as Etruscan influence waned. In the north, Etruscan settlers moved into the fertile Po Valley, establishing cities that thrived and expanded their trade networks. Ancient writers believed that these northern centers were colonies founded by Etruscan cities in central Italy, creating another loose group of 12 settlements overall. While the Etruscans were never united under a single political leadership, their cultural and economic presence helped shape early Italy in significant ways. Felsina, known today as Bologna, was one of the most prominent Etruscan cities. Pliny referred to it as the leader of Etruria, suggesting its significant influence among Etruscan centers. Ancient commentators even linked its founding to myth, associating it with legendary figures related to Perugia. The wealth of Felsina is clear from its burial sites at Villanova and Certosa, where elaborate grave goods have been discovered, including the famed bronze situla, a ceremonial bucket-shaped vessel. Another key Etruscan settlement in the north was Marzabotto. Positioned strategically along trans-Apennine trade routes, it evolved from a cluster of huts in the early 6th century BC into a planned town with a regular grid layout around 500 BC. This deliberate urban planning suggests that Marzabotto may have been established as a colony. It was later overrun by the Gauls in the mid-4th century BC and only sparsely inhabited afterward. One of the most striking discoveries from the site is a marble statue of a Kouros, likely brought from Spina, the major Etruscan port further north. Spina, located near the mouth of the Po River, was another remarkable city. Its grid layout, laid out around 530 to 520 BC, and the vast quantities of imported Attic pottery found there point to its role as a hub in long-distance Adriatic trade, particularly in grain. Spina's prosperity was well recognized, even maintaining a treasury at the famous Greek sanctuary of Delphi. By the time Rome dominated the region in the 2nd century BC, the Etruscan cities of northern Italy were largely under the control of neighboring peoples like the Gauls. Yet even then, remnants of Etruscan and Umbrian communities persisted in places like Ariminum and Ravenna. Overall, the so-called League of the 12 Peoples is best understood as a religious and cultural alliance rather than a militarized state or empire. While the Etruscans did establish settlements beyond their heartland in Tuscany, including in Campania and the Po Valley, these were not tightly controlled colonies in the Roman sense. Instead, they were urban centers connected through shared language, religion, and trade networks. These links, especially those extending into Latium and Campania, played a key role in shaping the early development of Rome. Latium was a region defined more by its people than by natural borders. The heart of this area lay in the plain between the Tiber and Anio rivers, with the Alban Hills forming its core, called Latium Vetus, or Old Latium. This area was home to the Latin people, who shared a common culture, language, and identity. Their shared heritage included the myth of descent from King Latinus, father-in-law of Aeneas, and widespread participation in religious festivals, like the Feriae Latinae held on the Alban Mount. This festival brought together dozens of Latin communities, many of which have long since disappeared. Pliny preserved an ancient list of 53 Latin peoples who took part in these ceremonies. Some of those names seem to reflect early settlements or tribal identities, possibly even small villages incorporated into Rome itself. The cult of the Alban Mount likely dates back to the Bronze Age, emphasizing its deep-rooted role in uniting the Latin world. The Latins also shared other cross-community cult sites, such as the Sanctuary of Venus at Lavinium and the Sacred Grove of Diana at Lake Nemi, ruled by the enigmatic priest known as the King of the Woods. Even in Rome, the Temple of Diana on the Aventine, built by Servius Tullius, functioned as a meeting place for Latin communities, positioned just outside the city's sacred boundary to allow broad accessibility. Beyond shared worship, the Latins were linked by formal rights, confirmed through early treaties. These included the right to intermarry, conduct business, and even move to and gain citizenship in other Latin cities. Rome was part of this network, yet its identity was unique. Unlike other Latin towns, Rome emphasized its mixed origins, preserved in legends like the asylum for fugitives created by Romulus or the abduction of Sabine women. Other stories spoke of prominent families who migrated from Sabinum or Etruria, further contributing to Rome's hybrid cultural character. This distinct identity helped frame Roman expansion under its early kings. Although the precise extent of Rome's territory before the 6th century BC is uncertain, ancient markers and sacred festivals hint at early, modest boundaries. From this base, Rome's kings expanded outward, first into the Alban Hills, then further into Latium. The conquest of Alba Longa, though largely mythical, symbolized Rome's absorption of neighboring Latin communities. Other kings, like Ancus Marcius, consolidated Rome's position along the Tiber and founded Ostia to control maritime access. The Tarquin kings continued this expansion, pushing into Sabine territory and reorganizing the Latin League. While ancient narratives about their conquests may exaggerate the scale of their achievements, the general pattern of territorial growth is credible. This is supported by records from the early Republic. One such example is the creation of new Roman tribes in 495 BC, suggesting that fresh lands had been incorporated into Roman control. Further evidence comes from the first recorded treaty between Rome and Carthage, dated by Polybius to 509 BC. The language of the treaty reveals that Rome controlled most of the coast of Latium, even while some Latin peoples remained independent. That Carthage acknowledged Rome's authority in this region so soon after the fall of its monarchy shows that Rome had already established itself as a significant power in central Italy. As Rome gradually expanded its influence across Latium, the Latin cities responded by forming a federation known today as the Latin League. Like the earlier Etruscan League, this alliance was rooted in shared religious traditions, which naturally evolved into a political and military coalition. Ancient accounts suggest that this federation was already active before Rome's monarchy fell. Even King Tarquinius Superbus was depicted as taking command of an existing Latin assembly at the Grove of Ferentina, organizing joint military action that included both Roman and Latin forces under his authority. However, with the overthrow of the monarchy around 509 BC, Rome lost this dominance, and the Latin cities increasingly acted independently. They even fought together against the Etruscan leader Lars Porsena at Aricia in 504 BC, though Rome's involvement at that moment is uncertain. A preserved fragment from Cato, dating to around 500 BC, gives concrete evidence of an alliance among Latin communities, likely aligned against Rome. This list includes cities like Tusculum, Aricia, Lanuvium, and Tibur, and notably excludes Rome, confirming that the Latins briefly united in opposition. The Latins eventually faced Roman retaliation at the Battle of Lake Regillus in 499 or 496 BC. Despite the later mythologizing of this battle, it marked a pivotal moment. Rather than crushing the Latins, Rome negotiated a treaty known as the Cassian Treaty in 493 BC, named for the consul Spurius Cassius. This treaty established a formal alliance and mutual defense pact between Rome and the Latin League. According to surviving ancient interpretations of the treaty, both sides agreed not to make war against one another and to jointly share the spoils of conflict, although Rome, being far more powerful, likely dominated the arrangement in practice. Over time, the League expanded, eventually including neighboring Hernici communities. The alliance served as a defensive barrier against the encroachment of tribes like the Aequi and Volsci, who posed a serious threat to Latium in the early 5th century. BC. The Volsci, in particular, infiltrated regions like Antium, Satricum, and Velitrae, even as Rome and its Latin allies resisted their advancement. These shifts were part of a broader pattern in Italian history, where hill tribes expanded into richer lowland territories. The Volsci and Aequi loom large in the Roman tradition of this period. Though surviving sources give only fragmentary details, archaeological finds, such as inscriptions and burial sites at Satricum, shed some light on Volscian culture and language, which was surprisingly more like Umbrian than Oscan. Their presence in southern Latium reflects a dynamic period of conflict and cultural exchange. One key area of contention was the fertile Pomptine Plain. The Romans were drawn to it for grain and wealth, as evidenced by religious votive deposits and monumental remains. Some ancient traditions claimed that spoils from the Volscian town of Pometia helped fund major Roman projects, such as the Great Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline. The struggle for control over this region contributed to economic strains in early Republican Rome and fueled internal social pressures, including demands by the plebs for land redistribution. As Rome gradually expanded its influence across Latium, the Latin cities responded by forming a federation known today as the Latin League. Like the earlier Etruscan League, this alliance was rooted in shared religious traditions, which naturally evolved into a political and military coalition. Ancient accounts suggest that this federation was already active before Rome's monarchy fell. Even King Tarquinius Superbus was depicted as taking command of an existing Latin assembly at the Grove of Ferentina, organizing joint military action that included both Roman and Latin forces under his authority. However, with the overthrow of the monarchy around 509 BC, Rome lost this dominance, and the Latin cities increasingly acted independently. They even fought together against the Etruscan leader Lars Porsena at Aricia in 504 BC, though Rome's involvement at that moment is uncertain. A preserved fragment from Cato, dating to around 500 BC, gives concrete evidence of an alliance among Latin communities, likely aligned against Rome. This list includes cities like Tusculum, Aricia, Lanuvium, and Tibur, and notably excludes Rome, confirming that the Latins briefly united in opposition. The Latins eventually faced Roman retaliation at the Battle of Lake Regillus in 499 or 496 BC. Despite the later mythologizing of this battle, It marked a pivotal moment. Rather than crushing the Latins, Rome negotiated a treaty known as the Cassian Treaty in 493 BC, named for the consul Spurius Cassius. This treaty established a formal alliance and mutual defense pact between Rome and the Latin League. According to surviving ancient interpretations of the treaty, both sides agreed not to make war against one another and to jointly share the spoils of conflict, although Rome, being far more powerful, likely dominated the arrangement in practice. Over time, the League expanded, eventually including neighboring Hernisi communities. The alliance served as a defensive barrier against the encroachment of tribes like the Aequi and Volsci, who posed a serious threat to Latium in the early 5th century BC. The Volsci, in particular, infiltrated regions like Antium, Satricum, and Velitrae, even as Rome and its Latin allies resisted their advancement. These shifts were part of a broader pattern in Italian history, where hill tribes expanded into richer lowland territories. The Volsci and Aequi loom large in the Roman tradition of this period. Though surviving sources give only fragmentary details, archaeological finds, such as inscriptions and burial sites at Satricum, shed some light on Volscian culture and language, which was surprisingly more like Umbrian than Oscan. Their presence in southern Latium reflects a dynamic period of conflict and cultural exchange. One key area of contention was the fertile Pomptine Plain. The Romans were drawn to it for grain and wealth, as evidenced by religious votive deposits and monumental remains. Some ancient traditions claimed that spoils from the Volscian town of Pometia helped fund major Roman projects, such as the Great Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline. The struggle for control over this region contributed to economic strains in early Republican Rome and fueled internal social pressures, including demands by the plebs for land redistribution. One of the most vivid moments in early Roman tradition involving the Volsci is the story of Coriolanus. He is depicted in ancient accounts as a proud Roman noble who, after being exiled due to hostility from the plebeians, defected to Rome's enemies. Coriolanus is said to have led Volscian forces on a sweeping campaign that reached the very gates of Rome. The sources describe this invasion in two separate advances, one moving along the Praeneste region and another pushing through the fertile Pomptine Plain. His attack ended only when his family left Rome to plead with him directly, illustrating themes of honor, loyalty, and the pull of kinship over vengeance. Although rich in emotional detail, this tale's historicity is uncertain. Coriolanus does not appear in official Roman records, which raises doubts about whether he was a real person. Yet his story reflects real patterns of elite mobility during this era. It was common for prominent figures to shift allegiances across regions, as supported by both literary and archaeological evidence. Whether or not Coriolanus himself existed, the legend underscores the genuine threat posed by the Volsci at the time. The archaeological record helps bring these literary narratives to life. The site known as Satricum, or Suessa Pometia in the sources, provides an ideal case study. Located in the fertile Pomptine Plain, it was first under Latin and possibly Auruncan control before being conquered by Rome and then seized by the Volsci excavations. They have uncovered a temple to Mater Matuta and large residences from different periods. New burials and changing building alignments during the 5th century BC reveal shifts in cultural practices that align with the arrival of the Volsci, an indication of their non-urban, clan-based society. This period saw warfare that was very different from the structured state armies of later Rome. Central Italy was marked by clan leadership, personal armies, and fluid territorial boundaries. Private war bands played a significant role in conflicts, often led by ambitious elites who pursued their own interests. One striking example is an inscription found at Satricum, dating to around 500 BC. It records a dedication to the god Mars by the companions of Publius Valerius, suggesting independent military action led by a prominent figure, possibly the same Publius Valerius who was consul in early Republican Rome. Other episodes support this picture of personal military networks. Attis Clausus, who migrated to Rome with his followers in 504 BC, is another example of an elite leading military clients. In 460 BC, a man named Appius Herdonius attempted to seize the Palatine Hill with a private army from the Sabine region. All these stories reflect a world where personal power, migration, and clan loyalty shaped military and political realities. Even in Roman society, these dynamics persisted. The Fabii, one of Rome's leading families, famously fought the Etruscans at the Tiber River in 479 BC with their own followers. Nearly the entire family was killed. Ancient writers tend to frame such events in patriotic terms, but they also reflect a decentralized and clan-driven approach to warfare. Clans like the Valeri and Vitelli maintained ties to specific territories and even supported local defense independently. These glimpses into early Rome reveal a society in transition, moving from aristocratic clan networks toward a more centralized state, but still deeply influenced by kinship, mobility, and martial traditions rooted in the archaic past. The evidence suggests that warfare in early Rome often involved private groups acting with the approval of state authorities, similar to the campaigns of the Fabii. Contemporary examples from Etruria indicate that this wasn't unique to Rome. One striking archaeological find is a hoard of bronze helmets from Vetulonia, each marked with the word Hapnas, possibly remnants of a clan-based military force. A similar scene of triumph in battle, featuring captured people and livestock, is depicted on a sarcophagus from Perugia, dating to around 500 BC. This era appears to have been dominated by elite-led war bands and clan-level militias operating independently of central control. Rather than the organized phalanxes often associated with later Rome, this period saw more flexible tactics such as raids, ambushes, and skirmishes. Scholars have built this interpretation from archaeology, inscriptions, and ancient narratives, even though the ancient writers often misunderstood or reshaped these events in the image of their own times. However, this interpretation must be treated carefully. We must consider the growing power of city-states during the 6th and 5th centuries BC, which complicates the idea that the state was weak or absent in military matters. Some private forces might have acted under official approval, despite the anachronistic tone of later accounts. The rituals of the Fetial priests are a key example. These priests oversaw declarations of war and insisted that enemies return individuals who had violated Roman territory, perhaps signaling an early attempt to curb clan-driven hostility and bring warfare under communal oversight. Turning to colonization, an example is the colony of Vitellia, linked to the Vitellius family. Colonization in this period was often a crude form of land acquisition, rather than a carefully planned civic project. Leaders like Publius Valerius Publicola are said to have established new settlements on their own initiative. In one case, he reportedly founded a town called Sigliuria, stationed a colony there, and only later saw it fall in battle. Ancient sources suggest that commanders could claim ownership of newly conquered land and were entrusted with its allocation. Early colonies in Latium, referred to as Priscae Coloniae Latinae, were said to have been established first under the kings and later by the Senate. More recent theories argue that these were joint ventures by the Latin League. According to this view, areas adjacent to Roman territory, such as the lands near Veii, became Roman territory and were settled individually. Land further south was used to create new cities, which became members of the League. These colonies often served military purposes, fortified to secure strategic locations. Initially, this theory offered a neat explanation, but later research has shown that many such foundations were built on pre-existing settlements and served varied purposes beyond defense. Colonies were often socially diverse. Romans formed the largest groups of settlers, but locals were sometimes included, especially when the goal was to repopulate depopulated areas. At Antium and other locations, even former enemies were enrolled as colonists. This fostered cultural blending, but also sparked periodic revolts. The eventual revolt of the Latin League against Rome during the 4th century BC, with many colonies siding with the Latins and Volsci, shows the complexity of this colonial system. The upheaval facing Rome during the 5th century BC wasn't an isolated case. Across central Italy, many regions experienced similar disruptions. Scholars often describe this time as a period of widespread crisis, marking a shift in long-standing power dynamics. Trade networks between central Italy and Greece weakened significantly, as seen in the decline of imported Attic pottery in both Rome and Etruria, the rise of Syracuse as a naval power, and its victory over Etruscan forces at Cumae in 474 BC contributed to the region's instability. This sense of decline is particularly visible in the fate of once prosperous cities in Campania like Cumae and Capua, which faced violent political transformations. However, what ancient sources often describe as straightforward military conquest may, in reality, have been more complex, likely involving gradual infiltration, internal coups, and regime changes. Some cities, like Cumae, had already seen political shifts, including the overthrow of tyrants and the establishment of republican governments. It's important, though, not to overgeneralize this era as uniformly destructive. While some southern Etruscan cities declined, northern and inland Etruria actually grew more prosperous. Wealth became more evenly distributed, and new forms of classical art emerged. Burial customs shifted from showy displays towards more modest offerings, and votive practices evolved. In areas where Oscan-speaking groups settled, the cultural landscape changed, displacing earlier Greek and Etruscan dominance. But in places like Latium and Etruria, local groups such as the Sabines, Volsci, and Equi failed to make lasting gains. Ultimately, Rome was the long-term beneficiary of these shifts, using the disruption to bolster its own power. One key turning point came in 396 BC with the Roman capture of Veii. Located just 9 miles from Rome, Veii was a well-fortified and wealthy Etruscan city perched on a tufa plateau. Its history of prosperity stretched back centuries, featuring elite tombs, imported goods, and monumental temples like the Portonaccio Sanctuary. Its strategic position along trade routes and control of the Tiber Valley made it a powerful rival to Rome. The tension between Veii and Rome had deep roots, including clashes over the Tiber's salt pans and repeated conflicts for control of Fidenae. The Roman assault on Veii, led by Camillus according to tradition, reportedly lasted for 10 years, an echo of the Trojan War in literary style. While the specific details may be exaggerated, It's clear the siege demanded huge resources. For the first time, Rome introduced military pay and implemented taxation to support the campaign. When Veii fell, its territory dramatically increased Rome's landholdings, opening up access to South Etruria and key northern routes. Much of the Veientine population was enslaved, though some were later integrated as citizens. Romans also adopted the city's religious traditions, inviting the goddess Juno to a new sanctuary on the Aventine, a symbolic gesture of assimilation. The upheaval facing Rome during the 5th century BC wasn't an isolated case. Across central Italy, many regions experienced similar disruptions. Scholars often describe this time as a period of widespread crisis, marking a shift in long-standing power dynamics. Trade networks between central Italy and Greece weakened significantly, as seen in the decline of imported Attic pottery in both Rome and Etruria. Meanwhile, the rise of Syracuse as a naval power and its victory over Etruscan forces at Cumae in 474 BC contributed to the region's instability. This sense of decline is particularly visible in the fate of once prosperous cities in Campania like Cumae and Capua, which faced violent political transformations. However, what ancient sources often describe as straightforward military conquest may, in reality, have been more complex, likely involving gradual infiltration, internal coups, and regime changes. Some cities, like Cumae, had already seen political shifts, including the overthrow of tyrants and the establishment of republican governments. It's important, though, not to overgeneralize this era as uniformly destructive. While some southern Etruscan cities declined, northern and inland Etruria actually grew more prosperous. Wealth became more evenly distributed, and new forms of classical art emerged. Burial customs shifted from showy displays towards more modest offerings, and votive practices evolved. In areas where Oscan-speaking groups settled, the cultural landscape changed, displacing earlier Greek and Etruscan dominance. But in places like Latium and Etruria, local groups such as the Sabines, Volsci, and Aequi failed to make lasting gains. Ultimately, Rome was the long-term beneficiary of these shifts, using the disruption to bolster its own power. One key turning point came in 396 BC with the Roman capture of Veii. Located just 9 miles from Rome, Veii was a well-fortified and wealthy Etruscan city perched on a tufa plateau. Its history of prosperity stretched back centuries, featuring elite tombs, imported goods, and monumental temples like the Portinaccio Sanctuary. Its strategic position along trade routes and control of the Tiber Valley made it a powerful rival to Rome. The tension between Veii and Rome had deep roots, including clashes over the Tiber's salt pans and repeated conflicts for control of Fidenae. The Roman assault on Veii, led by Camillus according to tradition, reportedly lasted for 10 years, an echo of the Trojan War in literary style. While the specific details may be exaggerated, it's clear the siege demanded huge resources. For the first time, Rome introduced military pay and implemented taxation to support the campaign. When Veii fell, its territory dramatically increased Rome's landholdings, opening up access to South Etruria and key northern routes. Much of the Veientine population was enslaved, though some were later integrated as citizens. Romans also adopted the city's religious traditions, inviting the goddess Juno to a new sanctuary on the Aventine. A symbolic gesture of assimilation, Veii's defeat had immediate social repercussions. Some Roman leaders, including tribunes of the plebs, proposed that citizens relocate to the captured city. Although these ideas were ultimately rejected, largely due to the influence of Camillus, they reflect real tensions in Roman society. The conquest was celebrated, but not without controversy. Camillus was accused of stealing spoils from the city and was even temporarily exiled. Yet while conflict and displacement marked this moment, Rome used the victory to reinforce its status, dedicating sacred offerings at Delphi and emphasizing its alignment with classical cultures of the Mediterranean. Rome's growing influence in the Western Mediterranean is clearly reflected in its second treaty with Carthage, as recorded by Polybius. Although the exact date is debated, it likely corresponds with the agreement noted by Livy in 348 BC. The text emphasizes that Rome's territorial control had not significantly expanded since its first treaty in 509 BC, but it had consolidated its authority over Latium. Romans were allowed to trade in Mediterranean waters and islands, excluding Sardinia. Rome was also now recognized as capable of founding colonies, an acknowledgement of its rising power. Carthage, meanwhile, sought to limit Roman activities near Africa and Sardinia, though mutual trade between the two powers remained permitted. The treaty itself shows that Carthage saw Rome as a power worth negotiating with, even amid the city's recovery from earlier turmoil. From the late 350s BC, Rome faced repeated threats from Gauls, Etruscans, Latins, and naval raiders. Despite this, it secured several key victories, such as defeating the Gauls and their allies at the Colline Gate in 360 BC. During this period, legends emerged of individual Roman heroes who challenged and defeated mighty Gaulish warriors in single combat, earning names like Torquatus and Corvus. These stories reflect both family pride and Rome's deep cultural memory of struggle and resilience. By the late 346 BC, Rome had positioned itself to expand southward amid conflict with the Samnites. The wealthiest city in Campania, Capua, appealed to Rome for protection. Although this could have broken an earlier treaty with the Samnites, the Romans accepted Capua's surrender, an act known as deditio, binding the city to their authority. This sparked the First Samnite War, brief but momentous, as it set the stage for Rome's growing involvement in Campania and beyond. In 341 BC, unrest within Rome's own ranks emboldened its neighbors. The Latin League, joined by former Roman colonies and long-standing foes like the Volsci, challenged Roman dominance. Cities such as Signia, Velitrae, Antium, and Circe took part in this coalition, showing how mixed population colonies often leaned toward Latin identity rather than loyalty to Rome. Still, Rome emerged victorious in the so-called Latin War that raged between 341 and 338 BC. The outcome transformed central Italy. The old Latin League was dismantled, and Rome imposed a new political system on the region's cities, like Tusculum, Arachia, Lavinium, Antium, and Velitrae, were fully integrated into Rome. Others, such as Capua, Cumae, and Fundi, were granted partial citizenship without voting rights. A third group retained allied Latin status and kept traditional rights such as intermarriage, trade, and migration. This flexible and strategic arrangement ensured Roman control of Latium and Campania, two of the most fertile and densely populated areas in Italy. Rome's territory nearly tripled, enabling it to tap into immense manpower reserves, a foundation for its later conquests. This expansion also redefined ideas of citizenship. Romans could now be citizens not only of Rome itself, but also of incorporated towns, known as municipia. This dual identity stood in stark contrast to the rigid civic identities of Greek cities, and laid the groundwork for Rome's future policies of governing conquered peoples across the Mediterranean. The struggles of the 5th and 4th centuries BC, including wars with the Volsci, the siege of Veii, and the Gallic sack, shaped Rome's identity as a state capable of surviving disaster and reorganizing itself. In contrast, Veii never recovered from its defeat and became a minor settlement. Rome's growth from these crises proved decisive, setting it on a path to dominate Italy and, eventually, much of the known world. Between 338 and 290 BC, Rome underwent a crucial transformation. After defeating the Samnites and securing Sabine, the Romans rapidly expanded their control, bringing most of Italy under their influence. By 264 BC, Rome dominated the peninsula. This period saw the foundation of numerous new colonies and a massive expansion in Roman territory and manpower. Italy shifted from a patchwork of rival states to the center of a growing Mediterranean empire, a role it would maintain for centuries. Modern scholars continue to debate the speed and causes of this rapid conquest. Ancient writers often credited Rome's success to its superior character, discipline, courage, and self-sacrifice. But this view has been re-evaluated. More recent research has emphasized the complex political and military environments of the time, noting that many Italian states were highly organized and equally ambitious. New studies have also highlighted the importance of social networks and military innovation across the peninsula, which allowed ideas, tactics, and technologies to spread rapidly. Rome's military prowess by the late 4th century was indeed formidable, but many of its rivals were capable of matching Roman skill and organization. In many cases, Rome's gains resulted from diplomacy, political pressure, and strategic alliances rather than outright conquest. The rise of a mixed Roman aristocracy during this era also fueled greater internal competition for military glory, reinforcing the drive to conquer. The Samnites emerged as Rome's most dangerous opponents during this time. Spread across a vast territory, they were organized into a loose confederation of tribes. By the mid-4th century, they were expanding into Campania, threatening Roman interests. Ancient writers described them as rugged people from tough mountain regions, and their armies were often a match for Rome in both resilience and skill. The conflicts between Rome and Samnium unfolded in 3 major phases, traditionally called the Samnite Wars, though ancient sources viewed them as a near-continuous struggle. The second phase began after Rome expanded into southern Latium and founded the colony of Fregellae on Samnite territory in 328 BC. Soon after, the Romans intervened further, attacking Samnite-controlled cities such as Palæopolis and Neapolis. Throughout this period, fighting ranged across central and southern Italy. The Samnites proved fierce defenders and achieved their most famous victory in 321 BC at the Caudine Forks. They trapped a large Roman force in a narrow pass and forced them to submit, a humiliation that echoed through Roman memory. Although peace was first negotiated, Rome later repudiated the agreement and rallied to eventually dominate Samnium by 306 BC. Rome's rising power did not go unnoticed. It drew the attention of Alexander the Great, who cautioned Rome against allowing piracy in the western Mediterranean. The Romans also engaged diplomatically with Alexander of Epirus in 332 BC and received acknowledgement from Greek and Phoenician powers. By 306 BC, Carthage renewed its treaty with Rome, recognizing its influence over Italy. Around the same time, Rhodes established a long-standing friendship with Rome, a sign that the city's reach now extended well beyond the Italian peninsula. This period marked the beginning of Rome's ascent to Mediterranean dominance, laying the groundwork for its transformation into an imperial power. Rome's campaigns against the Etruscans and Umbrians stretched across centuries, beginning during the time of kings and ending with the destruction of Volsini in 264 BC. Although the conflicts were frequent, they were broken up by long periods of peace and strategic alliances, such as those with Caere in the 4th century. BC Rome had earlier fought against Veii and the Faliscans, and later clashed with Tarquini and Vulci. From the 310s BC, Roman forces pushed north toward Perugia and Arretium, and into Umbria. By 308 BC, Roman armies had defeated a coalition of Umbrian forces at Mevania. They continued expanding by conquering Nequinum and establishing the colony of Narnia on a strong defensive site above the Nar River in 299 BC. One of the most decisive moments came in 295 BC, when Rome defeated a massive alliance of Samnites, Gauls, Etruscans, and Umbrians at the Battle of Sentinum. Rome's advance into Etruria was slower than in Latium and Campania because of the strength and sophistication of Etruscan city-states. These states were well fortified and often built on naturally defensible terrain. Their armies were highly developed and had influenced Roman military tactics. Initially, Etruscan cities acted independently or in small alliances, but Rome's growing power eventually forced them to unify, even forming coalitions with the Gauls and Samnites. The Central Italian alliance against Rome during the late 4th and early 3rd centuries BC was one of the most impressive attempts to resist Roman dominance. Livy reports that it was organized by the Samnite general Gellius Egnatius and brought together Samnites, Gauls, Umbrians, and Etruscans. Their combined strength posed a serious challenge to Rome's control. The Battle of Sentinum in 295 BC was a defining moment. Both sides brought enormous armies to the field, with Rome deploying 4 legions and a similar number of allied troops. Despite being outnumbered, the Romans triumphed. The Greek writer Duris exaggerated enemy casualties wildly, but the battle was indeed monumental. Its significance was later commemorated in local art, such as the temple frieze at Civitalba, depicting divine intervention against the Gauls. With the defeat at Sentinum, Rome secured dominance over central Italy. The Samnites were defeated again at Aquilonia in 293 BC, and by 290 BC, they surrendered. Unfortunately, much of the historical detail from this time has been lost, but triumph records show that this period was crucial for Rome's control in Etruria. In the following decades, Rome also crushed resistance in northern Etruria and Umbria, founded colonies, and built roads like the Via Aurelia and Via Flaminia. To tighten its grip on the region, control of the Adriatic coast became another key Roman objective. After establishing authority in northern Apulia and founding the colony of Luceria in 314 BC, Rome defeated the Senones and cleared the Ager Gallicus in the 280s. BC new colonies, such as Sena Gallica and Castrum Novum, were founded to guard the coastline and prevent enemy intervention. Ports like Ariminum and Brundisium also became strategic settlements that helped solidify Roman presence. As Rome expanded, it developed a sophisticated system to manage newly conquered territories. This included land confiscation, colonization, and the creation of alliances. Voting tribes were established across the peninsula to organize Roman territory. Initially near the city itself, later spreading across conquered regions. After the victory over the Samnites and Sabines in 290 BC, large stretches of land were seized and settled by Romans. The extension of Roman citizenship to conquered peoples was another powerful tool, but not always a benevolent one. While later authors romanticized this practice as a sign of generosity, contemporary accounts suggest that it was often viewed as a burden. Citizenship came with obligations like military service and taxation, and early recipients did not always gain full political rights. Some conquered communities received citizenship without the vote, while others were coerced into Roman citizenship through threats or after uprisings. By blending force, strategy, and political innovation, Rome converted a fragmented Italy into a unified network of allies, citizens, and colonies. This transformation laid the foundation for Roman dominance in the Mediterranean for centuries to come. One of the most effective strategies Rome used to secure newly conquered regions was the establishment of colonies, a practice that continued even after the Latin League was dissolved following the Latin War. There were two main types of Roman colonies: those composed of Roman citizens and those designated as Latin colonies. Each served a different purpose, but both were crucial in maintaining control over strategic areas. Ancient writers like Cicero later emphasized the defensive function of these settlements, describing them as positioned so wisely that they formed a protective barrier for Rome rather than mere extensions of Italian urban life. Appian notes that instead of relying exclusively on military garrisons, Rome would seize land from defeated peoples and establish towns or add Roman settlers to existing communities. The best agricultural land was often distributed to colonists, while the rest was either sold or leased, ensuring that both settlement and revenue flowed back to Rome. Roads were another key element in this system. Though basic roads existed earlier, the more ambitious network started taking shape in the late 4th century BC. The Via Appia, built in 312 BC by Appius Claudius Caecus, was the first of these major highways, linking Rome to coastal colonies and eventually to Capua. Other roads followed, such as the Via Valeria, Via Aurelia, and Via Flaminia, connecting important settlements across central Italy. These routes were not just infrastructural links. They enabled rapid military movement and ensured Rome could respond swiftly to any threat or rebellion in its territories. While some historians have seen a clear military strategy in the placement of colonies and roads, this view has come under scrutiny. Ancient sources often framed colonies more as tools for local control and population management rather than part of a long-term imperial blueprint. Nevertheless, colonies like Spoletium and Venusia did ultimately serve important military roles during later conflicts, even if that wasn't their original purpose. Roads, similarly, were political projects as much as strategic ones. Their builders often gained public favor and prestige, which shows that they had as much to do with Roman internal politics as with military planning. Recent research highlights how Roman colonies were often deeply integrated into local environments. Though sometimes former inhabitants were displaced or enslaved, in many cases they remained alongside incoming settlers. Colonies were often established in existing towns, enhancing or replacing older structures rather than starting from scratch. Over time, distinctions between colonists and locals often faded. Some Latin colonies, like Ariminum and Acernia, were mixed communities, and even allies of Rome were sometimes included in new colonies. Colonies also played an economic role. They helped distribute public land to Roman citizens, mostly small farmers, who could then contribute to military service. Colonization often served as a political gesture to gain support from the plebeians, and as a reward for loyal soldiers, it also addressed Rome's constant concern about maintaining a healthy and sizable citizen population. Alongside colonization, Rome used alliances to control Italy. By 264 BC, nearly every people south of the Po River were either brought under Roman rule or bound to Rome by treaty. Throughout its expansion, Rome preferred alliances that emphasized military cooperation rather than tribute. Treaties were made with a wide range of Italian communities and even foreign powers like Carthage. Some were formal, while others were based on fear or necessity. Not all Italian peoples were granted alliances. Many Etruscan and Umbrian communities were left out, especially early on. Those who sought Roman support, like the Marsi or Frentani, were more likely to receive favorable terms. On the other hand, states defeated in war could be taxed, subjected to temporary agreements, or granted partial concessions. Through colonization, road building, and alliances, Rome wove together a network of settlements and relationships that secured its dominance in Italy. These methods not only held conquered land, but also integrated diverse peoples into a system that would underpin Rome's future expansion across the Mediterranean. Many modern historians have questioned how far formal treaties really structured Rome's control over Italy. For a long time, it was assumed that almost every Italian community outside directly annexed or colonized territory must have been bound to Rome by a written agreement, and that the lack of surviving texts was simply the result of gaps in our sources. More recently, however, some scholars have argued that full written treaties may actually have been the exception rather than the rule. In this view, most defeated communities would have surrendered themselves to Roman authority and then been governed by more informal obligations, while only a minority enjoyed the prestige of a named treaty that they could later boast about. In practice, however, whether a community had a grand, inscribed agreement or a looser settlement may not have made much difference to what Rome actually expected from them. Even though no complete treaty texts survive from this period, we can still identify some core principles. These arrangements were almost never truly equal. Rome almost always came out on top. The central obligation was clear and consistent. Allied communities had to raise their own troops, pay for them themselves, and send these forces to serve under Roman command whenever Rome called. One ancient historian describes how Roman consuls would send orders to the Allied cities specifying how many soldiers were required, where they should assemble, and on which date local magistrates would then levy the men, administer the oath, appoint local officers and treasurers, and dispatch the contingent to join the Roman army. Structurally, this resembles the early Athenian leadership of the Delian League, where Athens coordinated allied contributions. But there was an important difference. While Athens drifted toward demanding money instead of men, the Romans continued to insist on manpower rather than tribute. At first glance, it may seem odd that Rome relied so heavily on allies, instead of simply turning the whole peninsula into Roman territory and giving everyone citizenship, as eventually happened after the Social War. The answer lies in practicality and politics. Incorporating every community as full citizens would have created huge administrative burdens and potentially destabilized Roman politics. Alliances allowed Rome to tap into the military strength of other peoples without directly governing all their internal affairs. The Senate could, in theory, demand every available fighting man from an allied people, but in normal years only part of their strength would be called up. To keep this fair and manageable, The Romans seem to have kept a master register of allied manpower, often referred to as the list of those who wear the toga, which allowed them to calculate what proportion of each ally's forces should be summoned in a given campaign. The allied contingents were a crucial part of Roman armies. In a standard field force, their infantry roughly matched the number of Roman citizen soldiers, and their cavalry often far outnumbered the Roman horsemen. They fought in separately organized units, kept their own ethnic identities, and probably used their own languages within the ranks. But they were placed under Roman-appointed officers. This structure gave Rome access to large, diverse, and experienced forces, while still maintaining overall control. The allies shared in booty and enjoyed the indirect benefits of Rome's success: safer trade routes, protection from rival powers, and a place within the orbit of a rising hegemon. The system's strengths become especially obvious in the Second Punic War. Only after the disaster of Cannae did major defections occur, and even then, many people stayed loyal and fought hard on Rome's side. The voluntary contributions of ships, men, and money to Scipio's African campaign later in the war show that cooperation with Rome could seem profitable and honorable, not just coerced. Rome managed this alliance network without the administrative machinery of a centralized empire. Municipalities, colonies, and allied communities were largely run by their own local elites, whose interests were closely aligned with those of the Roman nobility. This made the arrangement feel tolerable, even attractive, for those at the top of provincial societies. What later writers liked to praise as Roman generosity, sharing citizenship or respecting local autonomy, is better understood as a system born of necessity and convenience. Rome simply did not yet have the means to micromanage all its conquests, and it was more efficient to rule through partnerships and obligations. That this web of alliances survived the strain of the Samnite, Pyrrhic, and Hannibalic wars is a testament to how robust and adaptable it was. To understand why Rome was so successful within this framework, we also have to look at how its army and attitudes to war evolved. In some ways, Rome's rise resembles that of other city-state empires like Athens. Both started as leaders of defensive coalitions and turned that leadership into dominance. Yet the Roman system had distinctive features rooted in the Italian context. Rome did not rely on mercenaries. Its forces were built around citizen infantry, supplemented by allied contingents. From an early date, Roman warfare also involved directly seizing land from defeated communities, annexing territory, and sometimes enslaving or absorbing whole populations, as happened at Voi. This combination of citizen-based armies, aggressive land-taking, and a growing alliance network created a powerful engine for expansion. The internal structure of the army also changed dramatically. The older system associated with the so-called Servian reforms relied on heavily armed infantry equipped in a hoplite style, with round shields, bronze armor, and long spears, probably fighting in close-packed ranks. At some point in the 4th century BC, this was replaced by a more flexible formation. The infantry was now arranged in 3 lines: hastati, principes, and triarii, each split into small tactical units called maniples. This allowed the Romans to fight in a looser, more adaptable formation, better suited to the broken terrain of central Italy. A reserve line could be held back and committed at the decisive moment. The equipment evolved too. Oblong shields became standard, thrusting spears gave way to heavy javelins, short swords came into common use, and mail armor began to replace solid bronze. Ancient writers claimed that some of this kit was inspired by Samnite and Etruscan models, And while that may be an oversimplification, it reflects how quickly military technology spread across Italy through constant contact and conflict. These reforms supported a striking increase in army size. For much of the early Republic, Rome probably fielded 2 legions as its standard force. By the early 4th century, this had been raised to 4 in times of need. Each legion numbered several thousand men, and allied units added a similar or greater number on top. Compared with other ancient states, this produced remarkably large armies. At the Battle of Sentinum, for example, Roman and allied forces together likely numbered in the tens of thousands. Dwarfing many classical Greek contingents, Rome's advantage often lay less in brilliant tactics than in the ability to put more men in the field year after year. Sustaining such forces demanded money as well as manpower. Rome's economic system was gradually reshaped to support constant warfare. Regular property assessments allowed the state to know who could pay and who could serve soldier pay. First introduced during the Long War against Veii, became a permanent feature, and a direct war tax on citizens helped finance it. Increasingly, defeated enemies were required to pay large indemnities that could fund further campaigns. War thus became, in part, self-financing. Captured metals, slaves, livestock, and even architectural features were turned into cash or reused in Rome and its colonies. Reports of thousands of statues taken from an Etruscan city or vast numbers of prisoners sold into slavery show just how profitable a successful campaign could be for Roman commanders, the state, and its allies. All of this rested on a society that embraced war as a central aspect of its identity. Competition for glory among the elite drove consuls and generals to seek victories and triumphs. Ordinary soldiers, too, were encouraged to value bravery through an elaborate system of decorations and public honors. Stories circulated about exceptional warriors who had accumulated dozens of crowns, armlets, and other awards, or who had taken part in countless battles without ever showing a wound on their backs. Tales of single combat, like those of Manlius Torquatus or Valerius Corvus defeating towering opponents in front of both armies, may be embellished, but they reflect a culture in which individual courage and risk-taking were celebrated. Commanders occasionally felt the need to ban dueling with the enemy, which only makes sense if such challenges were common and potentially disruptive. War was an essential part of Roman identity from the very beginning. The rhythm of the year itself reflected this, with festivals marking the start and end of the military season. As the Republic grew, Rome began sending its armies farther afield for longer campaigns, often lasting multiple years. From the late 4th century BCE, it became common for legions to stay in the field over winter and for commanders to be granted extended authority. Keeping trained soldiers together made strategic sense, especially as the Roman army adapted to new formations like maniples. Society in Rome was structured around the expectation of war leaders, sometimes even manufactured conflict to maintain social order or keep soldiers occupied. In one case, a minor force was dispatched to a remote region simply so the year would not pass without military action. The Roman military system relied heavily on allies who provided troops rather than money, creating an incentive to wage war in order to make use of these resources. Peace was seen as a threat to the vigor and discipline of the Italian peoples, including the Romans themselves, who feared growing weak without constant combat. This culture of unending war was not unique to Rome. Many Central Italian states shared a similar martial outlook, expressed through their art and customs. Roman accounts often proudly recount the destruction of rival tribes. Some smaller groups were nearly wiped out, and thousands were executed in public as punishment for rebellion. Both Rome and its enemies practiced these brutal methods. Yet the Romans sometimes exaggerated their own victories, likely to win political or ceremonial rewards. Claims of total destruction often prove false, as later events show survivors receiving Roman citizenship or reclaiming their land. Even so, the psychological impact was real. The sight of defeated peoples and devastated cities would often force Rome's other opponents to surrender or negotiate. Some modern perspectives apply the idea of a harsh international system, where states must always be ready to fight to survive. From this point of view, fear was as much a driver of Roman expansion as ambition. Rome's position near fierce and unpredictable groups like the Gauls pushed it towards a more aggressive stance. The memory of a devastating sack of Rome early in its history shaped its future policies. In many respects, Roman warfare resembled that of its neighbors. Heavy infantry, personal valor, war trophies, alliances, treaties, and sacred rituals were all shared elements across the region. Many Italian states had elected leaders whose short terms encouraged bold military action. Yet this perspective risks oversimplifying Rome's rise. It can overlook the role of diplomacy, internal politics, and the involvement of ordinary citizens. Roman expansion depended not just on elite ambition, but also on the support of citizens who gained new interest in public life after key reforms. The messy reality of these smaller city-states interacting through alliances, betrayals, and personal networks was far more complex than a simple struggle of empires. Leaders from different regions often owned property or held influence in Rome itself, blurring the lines between friend and foe. In this fluid web of alliances and rivalries, Rome's conquest of Italy was as much about negotiation and integration as about conquest and destruction. The late 4th and early 3rd centuries BCE were a turning point in Roman political life. This was the era when the reforms of the struggle of the orders began to reshape the state, while Rome's expansion across Italy brought dramatic changes in territory and influence. During this period, many of Rome's political institutions took on the form that would later be recognized as the core of the Republic. Magistracies became regularized, and the Senate emerged as the dominant force in governance. These developments shaped a political structure that would be familiar to figures like Cicero and Livy. But because of the extent of this transformation, it is often hard to determine exactly how earlier systems worked. Much of what we know comes from sources that were written long after the fact, often clouded by moralizing views or nostalgia. Early authors, like Polybius, Varro, and Festus, give us valuable glimpses into these times. Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BCE, described a balanced and mixed constitution, though he tended to downplay the real extent of elite dominance. Meanwhile, antiquarian writers preserved glimpses of early institutions, but only through the filter of later perspectives. Despite these challenges, certain trends are clear. One of the most significant was the rise of the Senate as the central guiding body in Roman politics. Originally, the Senate was a loose advisory council chosen by magistrates, but by the end of the 4th century BCE, membership was formalized and became tied to former office holders. Thanks to a law by the tribune Ovinius, censors were required to enroll the best men from all ranks. This effectively made Senate membership permanent, as long as individuals were not removed for misconduct, and linked membership to a new concept of nobility, defined by service in state office. By the mid-2nd century BCE, the Senate controlled finances, foreign affairs, and internal security. Though it had no official legislative power, few dared to reject its advice. Magistrates, who served short terms, depended on the Senate for future opportunities and thus rarely opposed it. Yet debates within the Senate were real and even divided, as seen in discussions about negotiating with Pyrrhus of Epirus. Another major development was the emergence of a new nobility. While patrician families had originally monopolized power, reforms throughout the 4th century BCE opened key offices to wealthy plebeians. The consulship became accessible to plebeians, and eventually it was required that at least one consul each year be a plebeian. Similar changes opened up religious offices as well. As a result, a new blended aristocracy emerged, combining patrician and plebeian elites who shared both status and influence in the Senate. This effectively marked the end of the struggle of the orders, although the process of reform continued. Alongside these changes, new political offices took shape. Quaestors began to be elected, and new positions like praetors and curule aediles were introduced. Together, these roles formed the basis of the cursus honorum, the sequence of public offices that prepared ambitious politicians for the consulship. However, as eligibility widened, competition intensified. Military success became the main route to prestige, and generals fought fiercely for command opportunities. This was especially true once multiple consular terms became rare, and prorogation allowed ex-officials to continue as proconsuls or propraetors with military authority. This growing ambition shaped Roman political culture. New men, without ancestral senatorial status, rose through victories. Figures like Curius Dentatus, Coruncanius, and Fabricius helped conquer Italy and defined a new elite mindset centered on military glory, public honor, and rivalry. However, Roman tradition also stressed the danger of individual dominance. Stories of early figures who allegedly sought kingship and were punished became cautionary tales, promoting the idea that leadership should be shared among the elite, not concentrated. Despite the dominance of a small group of powerful families, the broader senatorial class remained diverse, with constant turnover among those who did not reach the highest offices. While Polybius described this time as one of political balance, signs of ongoing social tension remained. Tribunes of the plebs continued to pass laws addressing issues such as land rights, debt, elections, and religious access. Figures like Appius Claudius Caecus, who built major public works and challenged senatorial control, demonstrated how populist tactics could still shape politics. His aide, Gnaeus Flavius, revealed legal secrets and gained office despite humble origins, provoking backlash from the elite. Even in this period of apparent stability, conflict persisted. The third secession of the plebs, in 287 BCE, secured the right of plebeian decisions to become binding law. By the early 3rd century BCE, Rome's core political structure was in place: a powerful senate, a competitive group of magistrates, and popular assemblies that gave citizens a voice, but only within the limits set by wealth and status. While the plebeian movement had succeeded in opening paths to high office, the poor largely lost their independent representation as their leaders joined the elite. Yet some continued to agitate for reform, ensuring that Rome's political evolution was far from complete. From 367 BC onward, the dramatic political changes in Rome went hand in hand with equally striking shifts in society and culture. Rome drew immense benefits from its victories in Italy. War booty flowed back to the city and was poured into temples, roads, aqueducts, and other large-scale projects in and around Rome. A newly formed and highly competitive nobility looked for fresh ways to display its success and status. Wealth could now be channeled not only into public monuments, but also into fine luxury goods. encouraging the growth of specialist crafts. At the same time, new roads and military expansion opened up markets across the peninsula, helping to knit together the economies of different Italian regions. Renewed contact with the wider Mediterranean world, especially the Greek sphere, fostered a stronger and more confident sense of Roman identity. The most obvious sign of this new energy can be seen in the building program of the period, especially the construction of temples. Literary sources describe an early wave of temple foundations in the first years of the Republic, continuing the great building drive of the late 6th century. This was followed by a slump through most of the 5th century BC. Activity picked up again in the early 4th century, then paused once more until 304 BC, when an extraordinary burst of temple building began and continued almost without interruption until the eve of the Punic Wars in 264 BC. Many of these shrines were built to honor vows made in moments of danger on campaign. They served as offerings of thanks for divine help against Rome's enemies, but at the same time, they immortalized the general who had made the vow and won the victory. It is no coincidence that many cults of this period focus on success and good fortune. Deities with titles like Victor or Victrix, the personified figure of victory, and powers such as Fors Fortuna, all underline the idea that Rome triumphed because the gods favored her. This tendency to worship divine qualities themselves reflects strong Greek influence, where such cults had become widespread. Greek impact can also be seen in the introduction of Salus, the goddess of safety and well-being, and the healing god Aesculapius. Other deities show a different background. Consus, linked to grain stores, and the earth goddess Tellus belong to older Italic tradition, while Juno Regina and Vertumnus were originally Etruscan guardian deities, ceremonially brought over to Rome after the defeat of Veii and Volsinii, and given new homes in the city. Public infrastructure was another field transformed in these years. The scale of new roads and aqueducts reflects both the growing size of Rome and the need to support its population and armies. Appius Claudius, serving as censor, played a leading role here. He organized the construction of the Via Appia, initially a gravel road that linked Rome with Capua in Campania. Ancient writers emphasize how costly and difficult the work was, describing how high grounds were cut through and deep valleys filled to create a smooth route, and praising the road as a monument that would outlive its builder. During the same period, Appius also oversaw the Aqua Appia, an aqueduct bringing fresh water into the city from a source many kilometers away. By attaching his own name to both projects, he created a powerful model of political self-promotion through public works, a model that others quickly followed. The censor Marcus Valerius Maximus and his colleague Gaius Junius Bubulcus built the Via Valeria, linking Rome to Alba Fucens in the central Apennines. Not long after, another aqueduct, the Anio Vetus, was constructed and financed with the exceptionally rich spoils taken from Tarentum. These enterprises improved daily life for ordinary Romans, created employment, and gave their sponsors enormous popularity among the people. The heart of the city, the Forum, also underwent important changes. The speaker's platform at the edge of the Comitium was redecorated with the bronze rams taken from ships captured at Antium after a naval victory in 338 BC, and from then on was known as the Rostra, the place of beaks. The complex made up of Comitium and Curia, the assembly space and the Senate House, seems to have been reshaped in a way that recalls public squares in Greek cities of southern Italy. From the early 4th century, shops were added along the northern side of the Forum. These later received golden shields as decoration, set up by L. Papirius Cursor to celebrate his triumph over the Samnites. The display of captured arms and armor followed a pattern known both from Greek cities such as Athens and from Italic sanctuaries like the great Samnite site at Pietrabondante, where trophies of war were used to signal prestige and divine favor. The Comitium itself was already crowded with monuments, and more were added in this period. Earlier statues showed figures like Horatius Cocles, the heroic defenders killed by the people of Fidenae, and Hermodorus of Ephesus, the Greek thinker traditionally said to have advised on the earliest Roman laws. Later in the 4th century, a statue of Marsyas was set up, a figure that came to symbolize liberty. In Greek myth, Marsyas is the follower of Dionysus, who is flayed alive by Apollo after daring to challenge him in music. At Rome, he was closely connected with Liber, a god associated with wine and freedom, whose cult on the Palatine Hill had strong links with the plebeians. The choice to place Marsyas in such a prominent political space suggests that ideas about freedom, and especially the freedoms claimed by the common people, were being given a visible and provocative presence at the heart of the city. Around the same time, 2 more striking statues were dedicated in the Comitium, representing Alcibiades and Pythagoras. According to later tradition, these figures were chosen after an oracle at Delphi instructed the Romans to set up images in a prominent place of the bravest and the wisest of the Greeks. Dating to the second half of the 4th century BC, these selections are revealing. Rather than turning to the most famous names from mainland Greece, the Romans chose an Athenian general known for his Sicilian campaign and a philosopher who had founded a school in Croton in southern Italy. Pythagorean ideas had spread widely through the Greek cities of the south by this time, especially Tarentum, and a contemporary writer from Tarentum even describes the Romans, together with peoples like the Lucanians, Messapians, and Peucetians, as followers of Pythagoras. The reception of Pythagorean thought at Rome may have encouraged efforts to promote a more ordered and equal civic structure, and may also lie behind reforms to the calendar carried out in these years. Across the city, other monuments were renewed or created. A statue of Hercules was placed on the Palatine Hill in 305 BC. A few years later, the Aediles, having successfully prosecuted moneylenders, used the resulting fines to fund a series of works. Wooden thresholds on the Capitoline were replaced with bronze, new silver vessels were made for the tables in the shrine of Jupiter, and a great image of the god in a 4-horse chariot was set up on the roof. Near the sacred fig tree, known as the Ficus Ruminalis, they installed a group depicting the infant founders of Rome being suckled by the she-wolf. They also had the road from the Porta Capena to the Temple of Mars paved with stone. The replacement of the old terracotta statue of Jupiter with a more splendid figure in metal shows Rome updating its main sanctuary to match the standards of contemporary Hellenistic capitals. The new statue of the wolf and twins marks the first securely dated appearance of this famous foundation story in the city's monuments, revealing a fresh interest in Roman origins and a stronger sense of collective identity at a time when Rome was pushing more deeply into the Greek world of southern Italy. Changes are visible not only in public spaces, but also in private and artistic life. It is in this period that a native Roman tradition of bronze portrait sculpture seems to appear. The best-known example is the so-called Capitoline Brutus, a finely worked head from the later 4th century BC, which, whether Roman or not, shows that elites in central Italy were ready to adopt sophisticated, Greek-influenced forms of personal representation. At the same time, the first monuments that openly celebrated the achievements of individual Roman officeholders were erected in 338 BC. The consuls, C. Manius and Camillus, were honored with a special column in the Comitium. An equestrian statue of C. Marcius Tremulus, consul in 306 BC, was placed in front of the temple of Castor Carvilius, consul in 293 BC, had his own statue set at the foot of a new image of Jupiter made from armor taken from the Samnites. In the 280s, statues of the tribune Aelius and the general Gaius Fabricius were commissioned and paid for by the people of Thurii in southern Italy, the earliest known case of a foreign community sponsoring public monuments in Rome. All these developments point to an intensifying competition among the elite, who were increasingly eager to make their names, faces, and victories permanently visible in the urban landscape. The competitive spirit of Rome's elite in this period is also clear in the way they dealt with death. After centuries of very limited evidence, funerary practices reappeared with new energy in the late 4th century BC. The influence of Greek culture, especially from southern Italy, played a major role in this shift. Instead of the earlier custom of burying personal belongings along with the dead, new tombs used chamber designs and often included painted decoration. Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BC, describes funerals where a family member delivered an eulogium, a speech praising the virtues and achievements of the deceased. These speeches helped keep the deeds of the elite in public memory and reinforced the values of service, bravery, and honor, traits that shaped Roman leadership culture. Funerary speeches were often copied and kept in family records, and they influenced the way Romans thought about their own history. Writers like Livy and Cicero complained that these eulogies often exaggerated the accomplishments of ancestors, and we can get a sense of their tone from the few surviving examples. One of the most notable is the inscription on the sarcophagus of Lucius Cornelius Scipio Barbatus, a consul and censor in the late 4th and early 3rd centuries. His tomb records not only his high offices, but also his wise and brave character, his victories in Samnium, and his domination of places like Lucania. The style of the inscription and the design of the tomb reflect both Roman values and Hellenistic artistic influence. Another example comes from the funeral oration delivered by Quintus Metellus for his father. The family recorded that the elder Metellus had achieved the 10 highest goals of a public life: military success, eloquence, command, political honors, wisdom, wealth, a large family, and more. The speech reveals the full range of Roman elite values, which combined virtues, public service, oratory, wealth, and family legacy. It also subtly contradicts the later nostalgic view that Roman leaders of this time were poor and frugal. Instead, they took pride in being wealthy and successful. In this period, tombs became more elaborate, especially for important families. The tomb of the Scipios on the Via Appia is one such example, containing the remains of Scipio Barbatus and decorated with detailed stonework and frescoes. A surviving fresco fragment from a tomb on the Esquiline provides rare contemporary evidence. It depicts scenes of conflict and diplomacy between Rome and Samnium, showing that foreign campaigns were central to elite self-representation. The late 4th century BC also saw a renewed cultural exchange with the Greek world. Rome established stronger ties with southern Italian Greek cities like Naples and Tarentum, and began to interact directly with the Hellenistic kingdoms. Alliances were formed with cities such as Thurii, and Rome took control of Paestum and later Tarentum. Diplomatic contacts extended beyond Italy. Rome is even said to have sent envoys to Alexander the Great, and later received embassies from his successors. Around this time, Greek writers like Aristotle started to take serious notice of Rome, incorporating it into their geographical and historical works. The rise of slavery in Rome seems closely connected to the decline of debt bondage, known as nexum. While the 12 Tables show that slavery existed by the 5th century BC, it was less central to Roman society than debt bondage, which affected many poor plebeians and became a key point of struggle during the early Republic. For much of this period, the labor force needed for large estates owned by the elite was likely made up of debtors working off what they owed. The Licinio-Sextian laws of 367 BC attempted to limit the concentration of land, which suggests how widespread these estates had become. Things began to change in the 4th century. While evidence for early slavery is scattered, several accounts reveal growing demand for slaves. For example, after Rome conquered the Etruscan city of Veii in 396 BC, Livy reports that the population was sold into slavery. Even if not all residents were enslaved, the numbers involved must have been in the thousands. A few decades later, in 357 BC, Rome imposed a 5% tax on the freeing of slaves, suggesting that slavery was already widespread enough to be a taxable institution. By 326 BC, nexum was abolished, eliminating debt bondage and increasing the need for enslaved labor. Thus, the rise of slavery was tied not only to Rome's military expansion, but also to social reforms aimed at protecting citizens from debt. As one historian put it, the growth of mass slavery was, in a sense, a byproduct of plebeian freedom. Just as in Greek democracies, where slave labor supported the political rights of free men. By the early 3rd century BC, slaves and their descendants formed a significant part of Roman society. Appius, Claudius Caecus's controversial attempt to enroll the sons of freedmen in the Senate. In 312 BC suggests their growing numbers. He also tried to distribute the urban poor, including freedmen, across all voting tribes. Though these measures were reversed, they show the extent of social change underway. During an emergency in 296 BC, even freedmen were recruited into the army. By this time, Rome was becoming a slave society, where slavery played a major role in both the rural economy and urban labor, enabling intensive farming and crafts such as pottery production. Religion also underwent important changes during the 5th and 4th centuries. BC studying Roman religion is challenging because much of the evidence comes from later sources that tend to blur the origins of institutions and traditions. Many religious practices were credited to the early kings, especially the semi-legendary Numa Pompilius, who was seen as a founder of Rome's sacred customs. Despite this uncertainty, certain themes emerge, including the strong link between religion and the growth of the state, the influence of outside cultures, particularly Greek, and the role of religion in shaping civic identity. By the Middle Republic, Rome already had a dense and hierarchical religious structure. Several major priesthoods existed: the pontiffs, who managed sacred law and rituals, the augurs, who interpreted divine signs, the Duumviri Sacris Facundis, who cared for the Sibylline books and oversaw the introduction of foreign cults, the Vestal Virgins, guardians of the sacred flame, and the Flamines, priests dedicated to specific gods. Many of these roles were tied to early festivals and rituals preserved in the Roman calendar, a detailed document that recorded sacred and civic days. The Fasti Antiates Maiores, the only surviving example from the Republic, shows how deeply religion was embedded in Rome's religious life was open and adaptable. Although later writers claimed that early Romans did not worship images, archaeological finds suggest that Greek-style deities were present by the late 6th century BC Roman religion, mixed anthropomorphic gods with older, non-visual forms, and it readily absorbed new cults and traditions. The Sibylline books likely played a key role in authorizing this process. Especially during times of crisis, Rome's pantheon grew to include hundreds of gods from different origins: Greek, Etruscan, Italic, and even Near Eastern. Creating a remarkably diverse religious landscape, many gods were shared or adapted between cultures. For example, Apollo was worshipped in Rome, Etruria, and Greece with similar names, while deities like Minerva and Juno had Etruscan and Roman forms, but no clear Greek equivalent. Venus and Aphrodite, though similar, had distinct origins. The practice of worshipping divine triads, such as Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva on the Palatine Hill, reflects a blend of Roman and Greek religious ideas. Triads were also common in Etruscan and Greek systems, showing how religious identity was shaped by shared Mediterranean models. Religion in Rome was deeply intertwined with political power from an early stage. In the early Republic, religious knowledge and legal procedures were tightly controlled by the patrician elite. They treated sacred rituals, legal forms, and the interpretation of divine signs as privileged information reserved for their class. This monopoly began to break down in the early 3rd century BC, especially after the calendar was published and temple dedication formulas were made public by Cnaeus Flavius during his time as Edil in 304 BC. That moment marked a democratization of religious knowledge and reduced the patricians' exclusive control. The ruling class also used religious offices to maintain influence. Priesthoods were often held by elite families and became tools in political competition. The augurs, for example, could declare public assemblies invalid if they claimed that unfavorable omens had been seen. Religious authority extended to reinforcing the social hierarchy. Most priesthoods were reserved for men, and women were barred from certain rites, such as the cult of Hercules. However, recent studies have shown that women were not merely passive observers. They played essential roles in rituals, and priestesses like the Vestal Virgins, the Flaminicae, and the Salian Virgins carried out important state functions. The expansion of temple building in the late 4th and early 3rd centuries BC offered political leaders a powerful way to associate themselves with the divine vowing, and constructing temples became a form of political promotion, allowing generals and magistrates to display both piety and victory. The Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus on the Palatine Hill, stood as the ultimate symbol of Rome's political and religious identity. Originally commissioned under the kings, it became the central monument of the new republic, linking Jupiter's authority to the power of the Roman state. This association was most visible during triumphal processions. The triumph celebrated military success and divine favor, elevating the general in the eyes of the people while reinforcing the role of the gods in Rome's victories. Though it evolved over time, absorbing Greek and Hellenistic elements, the triumph always carried echoes of Etruscan and Near Eastern rituals. Religion also played a critical role in shaping Roman identity and community. It has often been described as a locative religion, deeply tied to places and public participation rather than private belief or personal salvation. religious festivals and rituals were linked to specific locations, like the Lupercal at the foot of the Palatine Hill, or the city's boundary markers during the Ambarvalia religion bound together groups defined by city, kinship, gender, and shared customs. It acted as the glue of civic identity. Prodigies were interpreted as omens affecting the community, not just individuals, and rituals were performed to restore cosmic balance on behalf of the whole population.